Greetings and welcome to the Saroth the Mage Experiment. Today I've got the excellent BJ Swayne, author of Living Spirits, A Guide to Magic in a World of Spirits. Now, BJ is a very experienced occultist. You've been practicing for over 25 years, had mentors in the AA. Could you tell us a wee bit more about your passage into magic and witchcraft?
Well, I started out as a kid. I was always interested in magic from the time that I knew what it was, and had tried sort of experimenting with it on my own through interactions with local spirits and just sort of guesswork and trial and error. And when I was about 11 or so, my father saw me looking at occult books in the bookstore and got me my first couple books, and it just sort of went from there. As a teenager, I started talking with other magicians and met people to learn from, and just kind of kept expanding.
Excellent. You're involved with the OTO, aren't you? You're a deputy master of an OTO body?
I was a deputy master, recently resigned a few months ago, but had been a deputy master for something like 13 years, 12, 13 years.
Yeah. Are you still in the Gnostic Catholic Church?
I am still a member of the Gnostic Catholic Church. I'm not currently performing clerical roles there. I'm moving on to work with the Church of Light and Shadow now.
Yeah. Very hardworking man. You've got a long and very comprehensive biography.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we're here today to talk about your new book. I think it's out this weekend, is it?
Yes.
Luminarium, a grimoire of cunning conjuration. So it's described as a system of spirit-driven spell work. And this is something I'm really interested in because I've been into magic for quite a while. But until really recently, I was of the opinion, it's all part of the magician's psychology, that Aleister Crowley quote about the Goetia being parts of the human brain and all that. So would this be a good book for me to introduce me to the world of spirits and working with spirits?
Yes, it doesn't go into theory or into sort of any explanation of what the spirits are or how they're set up or how they work. My previous book, Living Spirits, goes into that very in-depthly. This book is purely a practical book, but it's a practical book that's entirely driven by spirit work. So all of the primary work being done in the book is work with spirits. So for people looking to get started in spirit work, it's an excellent place to get started.
Yeah. So could an even less experienced person than me, say you were an absolute beginner, this was the first book on magic you'd ever bought, could you successfully use this only to get great results?
I believe so. I sent a copy of the manuscript to a friend who has never read any magical books and has never tried any magic. I'm still waiting to hear from him about his experience with it. But some of the people that tested it out did not have extensive experience with conjuration and were still within their first couple years of exploring magic. So I think very much it's designed for people who are just starting out to be able to use it, but also for people who have experience to be able to get some new ideas and some new ways to do things.
Cool. Because you draw on systems like the Heptameron, like Solomonic magic, the Hygromantia, which are quite, I've looked at them and it's very hard to know kind of where to start. You need so many tools and consecrations. How do you manage to kind of simplify that without losing value?
Well, this does eliminate a lot of that kind of where to start guesswork, and it draws its tools primarily from some of the material in the Greek magical papyri, and so the system of tools that are used are simpler. It also leverages relationships with spirits so that instead of using a big grimoire setup to create an initial relationship with spirits, because a lot of times when we're talking about those large conjuration setups in the grimoires, they're intended as a way for a magician to call upon and bind a spirit so that they can then work with the spirit more easily in the future.
Yeah, like an introduction. Yeah.
Yep. So with this, we're using, we set up a relationship with ancestral spirits, set up a relationship with the Holy Guardian Angel, and then work with some other spirits as well in order to kind of leverage the spirit world so that the magician is able to work with the spirits that they're attempting to call upon without as much setup and as much difficulty as they would necessarily have if they were just going straight in with no other spirit help or guidance.
Yeah, I really like that idea of, that's what I'm trying to do at the moment myself, is kind of introduce me to this, myself to the spirits. And there's also a current idea about a spirit intermediary, or like a helper spirit. So what would be the first steps of establishing this relationship with the spirit world?
So the first steps that I recommend to people, and the first steps that the book recommends, are establishing a practice of knowing and communicating with your ancestral spirits, and setting up some sort of shrine in order to acknowledge them, and to have like a physical touch point where you can go in order to work with them and communicate with them. And then the overall setup for calling upon the angels and the aerial spirits that the book presents is based on working in the space of that shrine. Then there's also prayers presented for working with the Holy Guardian Angel in order to come into contact with the angel and bring the angel into your sphere of experience. And there are prayers and conjurations used in the overall conjuration ritual in order to consecrate a lamp so that you can work with your Holy Guardian Angel through the light of that lamp so that the angel can impact the overall conjuration experience.
Nice. Another problem, I think, for people beginning to work with spirits is, I live in an urban environment. It's a very small flat. I also kind of share with children and a partner. How do you find space to make that place sacred and dedicated? Is all you need is just one little shrine?
Essentially, there's a lot of grimoires involve using a very large circle setup. A lot of times people talk about a 9-foot in diameter circle, although some of the instructions actually call for a circle with a 9-foot radius. And so you're looking at an 18-foot in diameter circle
Wow.
in some cases. And generally the idea there is that the circle is that large so it can fit in any tools that are being brought, any books, any additional assistants that are going to be there, or like apprentices or acolytes. And if you're just working by yourself, you probably can make a much smaller circle. You're probably going to still need something about 5 or 6 feet in diameter in order to have enough space for yourself, your tools, your altar, and for you to move around as necessary using a traditional circle setup. And that can still be pretty difficult to set up in the average living space, especially a space where people have children or have pets and maybe don't have a separate temple room to work in.
Mm-hmm.
With Luminarium, we eliminate some of that because it's working in a system where, again, we're using spirit allies to help set up the space. We're consecrating the space by calling on divine powers. And so we're not setting up a traditional circle space. We're doing something that's a little bit more like temple work by having a dedicated space that's used for that magical work. And so it's sanctified in order to create that kind of protection and that sort of spiritual space in which we can interact with spirits. And we're sanctifying it through the use of the ancestor shrine. So basically you would need a cabinet or a small bookshelf, some sort of flat surface on which you can set up your ancestor shrine, preferably against a wall so that things don't fall behind it and things don't get knocked over and the shrine doesn't get knocked over. And then you need another small table that you can place in front of that shrine when you're working, but that table doesn't need to be set up there permanently. The shrine is set up permanently, and that could just be in like a side corner of a room or along a wall in a room. You don't need to dedicate a whole room or a whole huge space. It just needs to have enough space in front of it that you could set a table and a chair in front of it. And that table could even be like a folding tray table or some sort of small entertainment table. It doesn't need to be some sort of big elaborate table or big elaborate altar. It basically needs to be able to fit a scrying bowl, a few candles, and some oils and incense. There's not a whole lot else that needs to go on the table. There's a couple other tools that'll be used in addition to those. You also need space for your lamp because the lamp is important. That's the light that's used for the Holy Guardian Angel. And That's about it, space-wise. It's something where you could be working in a small apartment, you could be working in a space where you have your family, and if you're setting up an ancestor shrine, if you have kids, then that's a great thing to incorporate with your family, with your children, because your ancestors are going to be concerned about them also and are going to want involvement with them as well. So it's something that can be a space that's a family space, not just a space where you're saying, okay, I have this thing and no one else intrudes on this space.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily taking away space from your whole household. It could be space that enriches your household. And
Yeah.
then sometimes when you're working, you just set up your little table for your altar in front of that, and you bring that altar into the sanctity of the space of your ancestor shrine. But that eliminates a lot of the need for a much larger space, and again reduces the major sort of footprint of tools that we need. We don't need to go through and get 6 different knives and 10
Forge your
different
own
forks.
sword and
Right.
yeah. I think that's a really nice idea of, not shutting your loved ones out of your magic, but like inviting them into that space as well, especially if you are working with ancestors. So how would you go about establishing contact with your ancestors?
Well, that's something that I think a lot of magicians today struggle with a first step on. And it's something where it wasn't really looked at in a lot of contemporary modern magic until recently. But it's something that's actually very simple to start with. A lot of it is just sitting and listening and being present and inviting them to be present with you. Your ancestors are present and watching and concerned about you already before you try to make contact, but seeking to make contact gives them a greater hold in the world, a greater ability to interact with the world, and opens up for that interaction with you once you begin to listen and kind of silence yourself and settle yourself so that you can pay attention to things that are beyond what's immediately in front of your normal physical sensory awareness. An easy way to start with that is to sit down and offer a meal and have a meal with your ancestors. But even before you take that step of making some meal that maybe involves foods that were favorite foods of a particular ancestor that you were close to and knew in life, just sit, light a candle, pour a glass of water. The candle light can sort of represent the illumination of the spirit and the presence of the spiritual force. The heat from the candle stirs the power that's needed to break through the barrier between this world and the spirit world. The water that you pour for them is a soothing, cooling uh, force that helps them acclimate back into the world and helps kind of cool them from the heat and fire that's needed in order to come through that barrier between the spirit world and this world. And so sit, light the candle, pour the water, tell them the candlelight is a gift to help them come through and talk to you, and a light that can show their presence. Tell them that the water is a gift to cool and soothe them while they're there with you. Talk to them about what's going on in your life. Talk to them about what's going on in the lives of your family and of people that they knew. And then just sit and listen and be present with them and allow yourself to feel that presence, feel that love and acceptance, feel whatever message they might have for you, whatever feelings they might have to communicate to you. And the more you do that, the deeper of a connection you'll build. And then you can start building to processes that are a little bit more obviously magical, that involve a little bit more ritualization. And the book talks about that, talks about how to do what I call an ancestor service, where you are making offerings at the shrine, talks about how to set up and cleanse the shrine, how to go through calling upon certain spiritual and divine powers in order to gain access to the ancestors and empower the ancestors further to work with you. And so it walks you through all of those things in order to really bring the ancestor work into where it needs to be to use this system. But it also goes over that initial step of just sitting, lighting the candle, pouring the water, and talking and listening, and just inviting them into your home to be your guests, just like you would if they were alive.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be some way back ancestor. It could be like your recently departed parent or grandparent.
I think that those recently departed ones are the best ones to start with, because they're the people that you have a connection that you understand with. It's not something where you're trying to build a connection to people that you've heard of or that you just kind of know about a little bit. Calling someone that you know, someone that you've walked with, someone whose hand you've held, that's a lot easier than calling somebody who is the famous ancient ancestor that
Mm-hmm.
you never had contact with. And not only is it the same kind of easy as calling up a friend versus calling up the CEO of a company, it's also easier in the sense that it's more comfortable for you. You've got the ease of someone who's ready to be responsive because they cared about you and knew about you in life. But you also have the ease of turning to someone that you knew and were comfortable with and had a connection to in life. So it's something where it should feel accessible to you. And another benefit of that is, since there is a familiarity there, if you really think about what you're feeling and what you're hearing, or what you're seeing, however they communicate messages to you, you know the voice of those ancestors that were alive.
Mm-hmm.
And by voice, I don't just mean the sound or tone, but the way in which they would communicate, the things that they would have thought or felt, the things that they would have told you, the advice they give. And so when we're trying to discern when we have actual spirit communication versus when it's just our heads telling us what we want to hear, if it's a spirit where we know the spirit, then a lot of times it's a little easier to say, okay, this presence feels like sitting next to my late father, or sitting next to my late mother, or my late aunt, or whoever it is that you choose to call on. And the advice that they're giving seems like advice that person would give. Or maybe, well, the advice they're giving doesn't seem like advice they would give, but it seems a lot like what my own personal biases would be, or it seems a lot like what I want to hear.
Yeah.
Then maybe you can sort of figure out at that point that maybe you haven't really made contact. Maybe it's you that's telling you that, and you need to go back to the drawing board and become more patient, listen more earnestly, and not chase after the connection, just sort of allow it to happen naturally and organically.
I think that's a very interesting point. When I've been trying to make contact with spirits, I haven't been sure, that hasn't sounded like a complete, although I did have a weird experience last week when I was doing a pentacle for spirits of Jupiter, and I had a very clear voice that didn't sound like me at all. And it actually gave me a little warning. And I thought, wow, that was, and I did pay attention because it wasn't me. You know what I mean? But how would you go about fine tuning these abilities to perceive spirits? I mean, people talk about visible appearance, but that must be an extremely difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, and I think depending on the spirits that you're calling, visible appearance may or may not even be an important thing to be concerned about. When you're starting out, and even once you're experienced, a good thing to do is to use divination as a means of communication, because that takes it a step outside of yourself, where it's not just what you feel that you're hearing or what you feel that you're receiving. You're looking at something that's a little more objective in order to determine what the message is. You can also do divination after the fact if you're just kind of talking and listening, in order to see if the divination supports that you had actual contact and supports what message you received. The big thing that usually people will look at to test that is, did you receive some information that you didn't already know? Did you receive some information that was actionable or testable and that pans out? And if that's the case, then you probably had good contact. Now, as far as refining that and fine tuning that, I talk about that a little in the book, as far as some approaches with mental exercises to build imaginal senses. Because your occult senses, they're not exactly the same as imaginal sense. Imaginal sense is things that you're creating in your mind and in your head, but it's dealing with the same capacity for the brain to receive non-physical stimuli and create a perception from that stimuli. And so the various stimuli that spirits create, it's going to be a non-physical set of stimuli. The brain is going to receive that, perceive it in some way, and allow your mind to interpret it. So the more practiced you are at dealing with things that are stimulating mental senses that are non-physical senses, the better those senses are going to respond when you're working with a spirit.
Makes sense. So which categories of spirits do you work with in this book, or do you cover everything?
The book primarily works with angels and with the aerial spirits, and so the kings and ministers of the air in accordance with the 7 planets, and the angels in accordance with the 7 planets. One of the testers for the book did conjure a demon using the method in the book, and sort of the prototype method that I based this method off of was a method that I originally used for conjuring a demon in a public ritual. And so you can amend the book's method somewhat for demons. You could amend it for various types of spirits, but the book presents it as a means for conjuring angels and for conjuring the aerial spirits. The book also works with, obviously, the ancestors, works with the Holy Guardian Angel. There's some Greek gods that are called upon as well from sort of an Orphic perspective. And so there's a few different spiritual powers that are touched, but the primary powers that are being conjured are angels and aerial spirits.
Okay, so we'd use them in individual spells, like, okay, I need a new job, or I need, practical stuff.
Yeah. So the book is kind of divided into 4 essential parts. The first part goes over how to prepare for doing the conjurations. The second part goes through the conjurations themselves. The third part goes through a selection of the Solomonic Pentacles and a series of spells using the Pentacles, the Psalms, some of the Abramelin squares, and some various folk practices. And then the fourth section is presentation of experience that a group of people who tested out the material in the book had. So there's a series of practical spells presented based on the planetary pentacles for the most part. And with the exception of Mercury, there are 2 examples given for each planet. Mercury only has 1. But they're all practical purposes. The book is intended to primarily be a book of practical magic. The conjurations of the angels you could use for less practical purposes. You could conjure the angel and ask it for help with something. You could conjure the angel and ask it for information on what you should change in your life to fix something or get the thing you want, or maybe things to change in your life to better yourself or to come more into contact with the nature of that angel or of that planetary sphere, or for it to give you various blessings or consecrations related to that sphere. So you can call upon the angels for information, you can call upon the angels for mystical purposes, or you can call upon the angels for practical magic. And the examples given are ways to use the pentacles that are consecrated through calling the angels in practical magic. You can also just call on the angels or the aerial spirits and make requests, or make some sort of deal where you will perform some task or provide some offering in exchange for them doing something for you. It doesn't have to break down into the spell work that's presented after the conjurations.
Okay, and it's presented like as a complete course. So you would ideally work through each planetary mode, if you like.
Well, it's not presented as an initiatory structure.
Yeah.
So, like if you're familiar with Rufus Opus's 7 spheres, that's
Yeah.
set up as you move through the spheres of the planets in order to initiate yourself into the planets and gain the various lessons and powers related to the planets. This is much more of kind of a straight angelic conjuration planetary sorcery approach. So it doesn't have the whole let's move through initiations, let's move through these spheres, let's gain powers that change us and develop us. You can use it for that, but that's not the focus that's presented. It is presented as a complete system for practical magic. So someone who has never done magic before, there's cleansing rituals, there's prayers for empowerment, there are meditations to develop the right types of mentality and awareness that are needed for the work. Then it walks you through what tools to gather. There's no real intense consecration for the tools. You can sprinkle some holy water on them and pray over them. Talks about how to make holy water if you have holy orders, and how to make something like holy water if you don't have holy orders. And then it presents what the basic powers that each planet relate to, and how to call upon the angels and the aerial spirits for those planets in order to utilize those powers. So it's basically start to finish how to do practical magic with the angels and with the aerial spirits, and then some practical examples. But its focus is definitely getting up, practicing, doing things to make stuff happen.
Yeah, sounds like just what I need. So you mentioned the pentacles. Is that actually making physical objects, the pentacles themselves, out of like the Key of Solomon or something like that?
The pentacles that are presented are ones that are selected from the Key of Solomon, and depending on how you're using them would determine sort of how you make them. So there's two examples of spells given in the spell section where you would paint the pentacle on the surface of a bowl and then consecrate the bowl, and then use the bowl for future consecrations and future work using that pentacle. There's other examples where maybe you consecrate a paper pentacle because it's going to go into like a pouch or into some other sort of talisman. There's examples where you might create a metal or wax pentacle for, depending on how it's going to be used, if it's something that's going to be set somewhere or carried somewhere. And those are, again, just with the examples that are given. And those examples are meant as a starting point to give you an idea of how you can work with the pentacles, how you can work with the psalms. If you go through the pentacles in the greater key, then you can pick any of the pentacles that fit what it is that your goal is. And then depending on how you want to deploy the pentacle, it would determine what type of pentacle you're making. And then you can use the methods in Luminarium to consecrate the pentacle in order to go ahead and use it at that point.
Cool. So is there like an underlying belief system, or would you need to, obviously you need to believe that magic works, but is there another element because you're mixing sort of Greek pagan ideas with angels who kind of Christian? Does it all work out?
I, setting into it, did not intend that people using it would necessarily need to engage in a particular belief system or particular religious system. Like you said, obviously they'll need to believe in magic, and they'll need to believe in angels and the various powers that are being called upon. But you should be able to kind of approach it broadly as long as you're open to some sort of higher power existing. The way it's written, there's a definite sort of Catholic influence on the worldview that influences how some of the preparations are put together. There's examples of working with Saint Raphael to prepare you. There's Catholic prayers for the guardian angel. There's prayers for Mary for preparing you. And so in engaging those elements, excuse me, you don't necessarily need to be coming from a Catholic belief structure, but you need to be open to the ability to use those spiritual powers and work with those spiritual powers, should those be the ones that you choose to use. One of the nice things about the way that this is set up is when it's going through the various preparations for the ritual work, it's not something where you have to do every preparation that's in the book. The idea is that there's a handful of options given for various different needs that you're going to cover as you're preparing, and you determine which needs are the ones that you need to focus on, and you determine which methods you want to use in order to go about focusing on those. And so there's a handful of methods presented. It also talks about what it is you're trying to get out of those methods and what the overall goals of preparation are. And so if there's other methods you find that are better suited to you, then you can utilize those other methods if there's something that fits your belief system better. As far as the actual conjurations, like I said, you'll work with your ancestors. The openings of the conjurations are sort of a combination of various Greek components, some drawn from Orphic material, some drawn from more kind of classical Greek religion in terms of the ideas of how the world is created. And I think those are things that most Westerners can kind of deal with, whether it's something that's necessarily part of their specific religious belief system. It's going to be something that's still part of their cultural identity and something that they're going to be aware of and able to work with, even if maybe they understand those powers through a different religious lens. They can still recognize those powers and those forces as part of the universe and part of creation. From that point, then we get to the point where, again, we're engaging the ancestors, and that's done in the book within a Greek context, but the book also talks about how you can amend that to other religious modalities if there's another one that you feel you're more comfortable with, or another one that you feel your ancestors would be more comfortable with. So that's not something that's hard and fast as far as what type of spiritual mindset you need. You just need to have a spiritual mindset that involves life after death and the ability to contact your ancestors.
Yeah. I think that's a major sticking point for a lot of people who are not Christian, is the kind of, do I have to pretend I'm a Christian to work this magic, you know?
Well, I think that there's an element of, once you begin doing magic and seeing the results of magic and interacting with spirits, you're going to come to a point where you realize, okay, there's stuff that's there that exists. And so you've got to believe there's something. What the actual nature of that something is can vary. And the way that I like to look at it is, the idea that we have in a materialist construct that one thing is true and nothing else is true is ridiculous. It's not something that actually plays out if you really observe the world. Many things can be true at the same time, even if those things seem to be conflicting and seem to be mutually exclusive, because there's going to be different perspectives and different contexts in which those things operate. And so when we're looking at things like, does this God exist? Does that God exist? How do these spirits exist? Where do these spirits reside? That's something where we don't necessarily need to say, just because we believe in A, then we also have to believe in B, or just because we believe in A means we have to believe that C is not true. Those things can all be true at the same time, and it's just a question of what it is that's being engaged. And this is a little bit different from kind of the classic chaos magic approach of nothing is true and we just decide to act a given way based on what's going on in the moment or what suits us. Saying that all of these things are true, then it means we still need to kind of respect the truth of those things and take that into account when we're interacting with those things, and that there will still be things that are not true, and that we need to sometimes understand when something's not true and therefore doesn't play into what it is that we're working with. But that just because we accept one as true doesn't mean that the others are not. So you can accept the existence of pagan gods, or you can accept that there are these divine forces that we can understand as these pagan gods, and that doesn't necessarily preclude there from being some other sort of divine nature that is beyond that individuation or beyond that kind of personified, anthropomorphized nature. And when we're talking about the God that is being called in the grimoires, a lot of times that's the way that makes sense to perceive that. Like when we're talking about the Lord of Hosts, that doesn't necessarily need to be a guy with a beard on a throne in the clouds. That can be sort of the overall power that coalesces and coordinates the various angelic forces and the various divine forces and spiritual forces that make up the cosmos, and that turn those from being a series of chaotic forces into a harmonized cosmos. And so, whether we want to look at things from the perspective of specifically Christian mythos, or if we want to look at things from a more general sense of the divine that could be understood through Christianity, it can be understood through pagan religions, it can be understood through Judaism, be understood through Islam, through various other religious modes, then that's somewhat up to us individually. But I think that we need to find a space in which we're comfortable and a space in which we believe in what we're doing, rather than a space where we're pretending and we're trying to sort of say like, okay, I can say these names, but I don't really believe that I'm calling on anything with these names. It's just part of the costume that I'm wearing for this.
Yeah.
You might get some effect when you're approaching it as just part of a costume. I think you'll get a much richer experience once you can move beyond that state. And I think those effects that you get when you're still kind of wearing it as a costume and trying to figure it out can still be powerful for leading you to understand what your ultimate understanding is going to be, and leading you to understand that there is something more to it than just, I'm going to put on these clothes and do these things and pretend that I think something is happening. Once something really happens, then that's going to lead you to start figuring stuff out.
Yeah. So I heard you say an interesting thing in a previous interview that when magic dropped the Catholic aspects and it started to get more Protestant, it got more complicated. They started adding elements.
That's something that I've noticed in looking at some of the grimoires and some of the workbooks of magicians. And it's something that's not necessarily going to play out 100% all of the time. But if you look at like the Heptameron, it's actually pretty simple to set up the tools that are in the Heptameron. You don't have a handful of different knives, a handful of different swords, a handful of different wands. You don't have consecrated pens. You've got a lamen, you've got a robe, you've got a sword, you use some holy water, you have some stuff prayed over at Mass, and that's most of it. Like, you've got the incenses, you've got the pentacles, but it's not something that's nearly as tool heavy as some of the later grimoire examples. Now, when we look at the way that the cunning folk worked, and a lot of what we have from the cunning folk is, of course, after the Protestant Reformation, the cunning folk still worked in simple ways that were practical because they were people that were working for practical purposes as their job in the community. It wouldn't make sense for them to do these big complex things, even if that's what some of the books that were being published were telling people to do. I think when we're kind of looking at things in a context where books are written with the expectation that the people using them are going to have some sort of clerical background, some sort of holy orders assigned to them, and they're going to be working in some sort of church or monastic environment, then it assumes that they're going to be engaging in tools and materials that are already touching sacramental elements and already have sacramental power associated with them. When we start moving away from that, then we start having to have things where special signs and seals are sewn with special thread into robes that have been made with specially wound threads. Yeah. And we have to have multiple knives that are carved with tools that have been consecrated, and wands that are cut with a single stroke with a yeah. consecrated knife at a special time of day, because we have to find ways to spiritually empower the things that we're using, because we're not working in a context that's already spiritually empowered.
Yeah,
there are going to be texts that deviate from that kind of view, but like, for instance, look at the Ars Notoria, or the Flowers of Heavenly Teaching, which is part of the Ars Notoria textual tradition, where, like an example, the Flowers of Heavenly Teaching, you work through a series of prayers to gain a vision of Mary. And then from that point of working with the prayers to gain the vision of Mary, then you're able to work through more prayers to gain more visions, and then also to gain dreams to teach you different things. And you're basically looking at some images and saying some prayers. Actually, I think Flowers of Heavenly Teaching may have eliminated the images as part of its attempt to try and make the Ars Notoria seem less magical and less diabolical.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it seems diabolical with the images there, but that was the accusation at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But even in your standard Ars Notoria, it's basically look at some images and say some prayers. And that's a text where we have examples of that going back to the 13th century, maybe earlier. And so it's one of the earliest grimoire examples, and it's definitely a grimoire that's existing within a Catholic context. And it's one that's not using huge amounts of tools in order to set up what it's doing and in order to communicate with the angelic powers that it's communicating with.
Yeah. So in Luminarium, you're really trying to go back to simpler methods that are less prohibitive for beginner magicians and people that aren't so experienced, really.
Yes, and Luminarium accomplishes that by using magical techniques in order to empower the magician. So, for example, whereas in a grimoire you might take a bath and sort of say some prayers and meditate, or you might avoid certain things that would make you unclean for a time. In Luminarium, it's going to give you an uncrossing formula for the bath so that you're using magically empowered techniques in order to ritually cleanse yourself. So it's something where you're doing it faster, you're doing it more potently. You'll call upon saints and angels and divine figures to empower yourself leading up to the conjuration, so that it's not just that you're abstaining from things for days, but you're actually working magic to make yourself more spiritually ready, to build that spiritual fire, to build that charism in yourself that you're going to be able to then take into your ritual and use in order to perform the ritual. And then within the ritual, it uses a spell from the Greek magical papyri in order to call upon your holy guardian angel through the consecration of a lamp, and so that the light of that lamp dispels any darkness of the conjuration and allows you to more clearly see and more clearly understand. So even if you're coming to it from a perspective of not having a lot of experience scrying and not having a lot of experience seeing or communicating with spirits, it won't necessarily make it so first time out you have some amazing vision, but it will start to empower those faculties and open those faculties up and make whatever faculties you have stronger and more potent and clearer, so that as you're developing them, you get more effect out of them when you're using them there. So it's basically using magic and using spirits in order to kind of leverage what you've got so that you don't need as much.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that put me off. It was like, okay, first I've got to get the consecrated this, and then I've got to consecrate that, and then I've got to like stay pure for like 9 days. And then, in a modern world, it's very difficult to achieve that kind of, abstinence. And, you've got to go out into the world to work. How do you live like a monk in the 21st century? It's very difficult. So I think you're doing a great service to the magical community by this book.
Thank you.
So what kind of early experiences would be an indicator that you're on the right track? We're not expecting things to appear in plumes of smoke. Are you actually using the bowl to scry for visions in like in a liquid in the bowl, or how does that work?
Yep, the bowl is, again, the bowl is consecrated as you're consecrating the lamp, and so you're going to scry in the bowl for visions and in order to see the spirits or see whatever the spirits want to show you. In some Greek systems, you would use oil in the water in order to facilitate the scrying. So in Luminarium, we consecrate oil through the conjuration. And then as the consecration is completing, then we add the consecrated oil into the water so that you have something that is essentially physically tied to the consecration, tied to calling the angel, and then you're putting that physical thing into the water so that the movement of that oil through the water helps stir the ability to have those visions, in addition to the light that's now illuminating your sight from the lamp that's been consecrated.
Nice.
So it's intending to make that part of the process a little bit more accessible than the idea that you've got to sort of jump in and try to make a goblin show up in front of you and actually shake its hand, and other people could walk in the room and see it. Like it's not trying to tell you that that is your bar of success, because that shouldn't be the bar of success, especially not when you're starting out. Your bar of success should really be, if you ask the spirit to do something for you, does that thing happen?
Mm-hmm. And should you set, like, I've heard some people say, oh, you should set a time limit. So I want this to happen in a week or 2 weeks.
I think it depends on the goal. And I've definitely done things where I've set time limits before. Early on in my experiments with spirit magic, and I mean, this example that I'm thinking of goes back like 14, 15 years ago. I once asked a spirit to help someone understand certain things about his behavior, and for that person to come and talk to me about them, and set a deadline for when that person needed to come and talk to me. And it was maybe a half hour before midnight, something like that, on the last day of the deadline. The person comes walking up across a field and starts unloading, talking to me completely about the subject out of nowhere. And so sometimes for things like that, that can be a good way of knowing if what it is that you requested is happening because you requested it from the spirit, or if there's just some random coincidence happening. If it's happening within a certain time frame that you suggested or that you requested from the spirit, then that can be a good indicator. But there's some goals that are goals that may be bigger or may take more time, and they're things that maybe you're going to leave it open-ended. And sometimes those are things where you will still know because of the nature of the manifestation, either because of things that happen surrounding it, or because of the way in which it comes into your life, or maybe just because it's something that you asked for that was not going to just happen on its own, and this spirit's the only thing that you've gone to for help with it. Then maybe those sorts of goals are things that you don't need to put a time frame on, and you can give a little more time to, as long as they happen within the time that you need. So you might communicate to the spirit like that this is sort of when this has to happen by, but that can be a little different than saying, I want you to have this occur by Wednesday of next week. If it's something where you're like, okay, if I don't have this issue resolved in the next 3 months, this is going to be a big problem. So I need you to do this because I needed to resolve this particular issue. You're leaving the spirit a little more time, a little more leeway, but there's still a sense of this is not something that can just happen any old time 6 years from now or whatever. Because at that point, it's like, all right, is it really the magic, or is it just like, well, something happened later on that kind of matches something that you wanted a long time ago? An example for that with this particular system, when I did the initial sort of public variation where we conjured a demon, at least 2 of the people who requested things had their things happen actually right around the same time as each other, but it was something like, I think like 2 months after the actual conjuration. It was a good bit of time, and that's enough time where some people might think like, oh well, you're beyond the time frame that you would assume, like just 1 lunar cycle or 1 month a spirit should be able to accomplish things. But these were both big things. Like in one case, person got like, I think something like $30,000 that they had requested, and the other person, they were having difficulty with a coworker. The coworker was like their boss's best friend, and the boss ended up determining that the coworker was a problem and firing that coworker. And so it was something where there was like no chance that that was just going to randomly happen in the office, because of how tight the boss and the coworker were. So And both of those people, when they had their things happen, they came back to me to get information on the name of the spirit and information about who the spirit was, so they could go back and pay the offerings to the spirit that they had promised. And they both came to me like within days of each other to get
Wow.
that information. So
That's an interesting point. How does it work, the transaction? You know, is it you do something for me, I do something for you? Or do different classes of spirits want different kind of things? Do angels want to help humanity evolve? You know, how does that work? I know it's a rather three-part question there, but
I think somewhat it depends on the type of the spirit, and it depends on the nature of the request. So with an angel, yeah, an angel might be willing to do something without you necessarily offering something back. But in that case, the angel is likely going to want to talk to you about kind of your behavior and your choices and your life and how you got to the point where you need to be asking for this, or what things you need to kind of fix or change in your life in order to make your situation more likely to occur. Because if you're not working with an angel on sort of a transaction basis, then the angel is probably working with you from the perspective of it sees the divine potential and nature in you, and it loves that about you, and so it wants to see that actualized, and so it wants to help guide you to actualizing that through whatever interaction you're having. At least that tends to be my experience of angels and the experience of a lot of people that I know who work with angels. And so usually with angels, I don't tend to approach them in a very transactional way. I kind of approach them expecting that it's going to be that sort of interaction of development. If I'm working with an aerial spirit or with a demon or with the dead, then I'm expecting something where it's going to be a little bit more of a give and take. And so there are some spirits where they are going to need something in order to get started. The My OTO lodge has a familiar spirit, and the people who've worked most closely with that have said that they've routinely gotten communication from the spirit that it wants to do the things that it's contracted for, it wants to do the things that we want it to do, but it needs some part of its payment first, because that part of its payment kind of activates its ability to work on those things in the world.
mm-hmm.
In my experience and understanding of working with the dead, that can also be the case with them, that in order for the dead to work in the world, they need to be given things to allow them to come through into the world. They need to be given things that help empower and strengthen them to work in the world. And so you don't necessarily want to pay these spirits for doing the job before they do the job. It's just like hiring a contractor. Like if you hire someone to come and tear down your deck and build a new deck, and they come and they tear down the deck and say that they want you to pay them for the whole job, and they'll be back next week to build a new deck, there's a good chance you're not getting a new deck. They've already been paid, so they'll move on to the next job. It's kind of a classic old con. And of course, not reputable contractors wouldn't work that way, but reputable contractors will have you pay in installments. Similar for spirits, like they might need an installment, they might need something for getting started, just like a contractor might need something for the initial materials they're buying, but there's still going to be the expectation that you pay the actual thing that's being offered at the end. So sometimes I'll talk about making kind of a good faith offering, and then explaining what the actual offering that you're going to pay is once the thing is done. So when you call on the dead to do something, and if you're just sort of working in kind of a standard ancestral work capacity, then you're going to give them candlelight or fire or lamplight, something that has heat and light to it in order to bring them into the world. You're going to give them water. Maybe you'll give them some whiskey or some beer or some honey, maybe some incense. And those are things that you're giving them to show appreciation for the fact that they're there talking with you and interacting with you. And when you give them, explain that that's what it is, that you're You're giving them these things in order to help them be there to talk to you. You're giving them these things in order to strengthen them to be there to talk to you, to thank them for things that they've helped you with before. And that's very important, that you're acknowledging the continuity of the relationship.
Yeah.
And to thank them for the promise of future aid. So you're not giving things just to give them. You always want to contextualize that in a magical relationship, as opposed to like a religious devotional relationship. You're contextualizing that what you're giving is still an exchange of power. There's still, you're giving something that is helping them help you. You're giving something that's thanking them for helping you. You're giving them something for their time. You're giving them something for their presence. But you're not just saying, you are so wonderful and so deserving of adoration that I'm just going to give you all these things and that's it. Because that sets up a different sort of dynamic. And it's a weird dynamic that you then have to try to re-navigate and renegotiate later when you want to actually work in a magical sense. Once you get to the point where you're saying, hey, I need help with this. So like, say you go to your ancestors and you make your initial offerings to start the conversation, and you're telling them about things going on in your life, and you're like, yeah, there's an opening for a promotion at work, and I really think that I should get that promotion, but I don't think the boss is looking at me for it. So I want your help with that. And the way that they help can kind of go from there. Like maybe they're going to tell you, all right, say these prayers to this saint or to God or to this specific God. Or maybe they're going to say, all right, conjure this spirit and have us help you conjure the spirit. Or maybe they'll say, sure, we can work on that and we can just help that happen for you. Or use this type of spell that you're familiar with and we'll help you with the spell. And regardless of what the answer is, there's going to be something where they're assisting with it. And so you're going to offer that you're going to give them something that's beyond what your normal daily offerings would be in exchange for the help they give. And they get that thing when that's completed. If it's something where there might be pieces to it, maybe they get pieces of it as parts of it are completed. So like once there was something I asked my ancestors for help with, and they said that they wanted chocolate coins as part of the payment, which was really weird to me because it was something I would have thought of. And there was like chocolate coins and rum. And I was like, well, I always give you guys whiskey. I have a special bottle of whiskey, and then I have wine for a special gift for you. Like, but we don't want those for this. For this, we want chocolate coins and rum. And I was like, okay, well, this must be real because there's no way I would expect that this is what they want. And so as little pieces of what I was asking for were happening, I would put a new chocolate coin on the altar. And then once I got the actual thing that I wanted, then I got a bottle of rum, and they got the rest of the chocolate coins, and they got the bottle of rum. When I would talk to them in the meantime, they'd still get their whiskey, they'd still get their incense and their candlelight and their water. And I'd talk with them about like, okay, well, I still need this thing, and I've got the rum, I've got the chocolate coins, I'm going to go get the rum when it happens. And once it happens, then you get that. And then when stuff started happening, then it's like, okay, I see you're working on it. I see you're getting stuff going. Here's a chocolate coin. Thanks for what you've done so far. Hopefully this helps keep you guys going on it. And I'll keep coming and talking to you about it. And so if it's something that's an all-in-one thing, then yeah, you're going to give them kind of like the good faith offerings that help them work in the world. And then at the end, you're going to give them the payment for the thing that they did. When you talk to them to give them the payment, you're still going to give them the regular things that you would regularly give them, because you still need that in order for them to come through and talk to you. And with your ancestors, it's probably an ongoing thing where you're going to keep talking with them about other things in your life. But they get the thing when they do the thing, not like at the beginning where you're like, oh, mighty and powerful spirits, I need the help with this. Here's this gift. Please, after I've given you the gift, go and do it. I was at a class once that Jason Miller was teaching, and someone was talking about how they kept giving Saint Expedite his pound cake, and Saint Expedite kept not giving him the thing that he was asking for. And Jason was like, well, you already gave him the pound cake.
Yeah.
You got to hold off on that. There was and Santeria priest who told me about working where you make this special kind of cake that this one Orisha likes, and you do it in a space where the Orisha can see and where you can talk to the Orisha, and you tell it all about the problem that you're having that you need help with while you make the cake. And then when you're done, like, oh yeah, this cake is really good, and you have some of the cake, and then you're like, and I'll make one for you once you've helped me with this problem.
So
So
it's like almost like baiting a hook.
yeah, and there's a lot of magic and a lot of cultures that work that way, where you kind of show the spirit the thing, or talk to the spirit about the thing, and then you give the thing once the spirit has helped you.
So just a little silly technical point here, but I've sometimes made offerings to spirits and then it's sat on my altar for a couple of weeks, and then I think, okay, well, what do? Do I eat it myself? Do I pour it? You know, what? How do you respectfully dispose of stuff that's been left on the altar that served its purpose?
That's one that I think a lot of people struggle with, and I have struggled with it myself. Depending on the thing, it's going to kind of determine some of your options for getting rid of it. In a lot of traditions, you can just throw it away once the offering is done. Like once you feel that the spirit has taken what it needs, then you just throw it out. In some cultures and some magical traditions, there may be spirits that are related to the trash, and so when you are throwing it away in a sort of consecrated receptacle, then those spirits that are related to that receptacle are getting their portion of it. There's ways that maybe you can give offerings that go to people who might represent that spirit. If it's a food or a drink offering, and it's something where you've offered it and it's in a condition where it can be consumed by someone still, then depending on the spirit, maybe going and giving it to a homeless person, or going and feeding it to animals, or putting it in a place where animals might be able to get it. Those can be options, again, depending on the nature of the offering and the nature of the spirit and sort of what the spirit might connect to. Going to a crossroads, leaving the offering at the crossroads can be an option, again, depending on what it is. Burying the offering or burning the offering might be options as well. So, like if I'm cleaning my ancestor shrine, then not so much the offering, but the paper towels that I've soaked in the cleansers that I'm using. After I'm done with those, I'll burn those so that it's burning off any miasma that has kind of accumulated around the ancestor shrine, in addition to the cleaning that I've actually done physically with it.
I guess a lot of it kind of intuitive. You start to build up a kind of intuitive sense of what should be done with these things.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any dangers in working with, say, aerial spirits?
Well, I kind of always approach that sort of "are there any dangers" question with a little bit of hesitance, because any magic you're doing, there's some potential danger. But we say that and it kind of sounds ominous, but most things we do in life, there's some potential danger. Yeah. There's things that can go wrong. There's things where a spirit might not understand exactly what it is you're asking for, or might not understand how you need the thing to manifest. It might be something where you call a spirit that has power to deal with a thing that is the issue for you, but maybe the nature of the spirit isn't one that is suited to the way in which you need the thing to manifest, or suited to kind of the conditions or the moments involved in your life at the time. And so maybe a different type of spirit that can do the same thing would have been a better choice. And so it might get you the thing you want, but it might get it for you in a way that is not as pleasant or not as compatible with how you want it. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean like you ask for money and a relative is going to die
Yeah,
something.
that's like the monkey's paw effect, I think they call that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that's super unusual. Like I had a famous occult author once years ago reference the monkey's paw in a conversation with me, and I was like, does this guy actually do magic? Because it doesn't usually happen that way, and there's elements as to why it shouldn't in most cases. But even if it's not like some catastrophe, there could still just be things where it's just not as comfortable or not as useful as it could be. But bad stuff could still happen because you might not quite realize what you're asking for or realize the way you're asking for it. There are things where maybe you're not particularly compatible with the experience you're asking for from a spirit. So, like if you're asking a spirit to give you a visionary experience or give you dreams or open you up to certain types of awarenesses, maybe you're not in a place where you've prepared right for those. And so that can be dangerous. But for the most part, I mean, as I'm like pointing out these elements of how things could be dangerous or how they could go wrong, I'm kind of reaching because
Yeah.
for the most part, like it shouldn't be that stuff is going to go wrong or that stuff is going to be dangerous. It's always possible, but that's part of the way that the system in Luminarium is set up is you're using your ancestors, you're using your holy guardian angel as kind of the context for conjuring whatever spirits you're conjuring. And so they're there to protect you and they're there to guide the work and balance the work of whatever spirit it is that you're working with, so that if the spirit doesn't necessarily understand how you need the thing to move into your life, because the spirit is not a human and doesn't necessarily get elements of human lives, you've got your ancestors there who were human and know what human lives are like, and they know what your life is like. And so they're going to be able to help put some leverage, put some direction into how the spirit is manifesting things and help guide it into something that is right for you. Your guardian angel is looking out for you, trying to get you to the best place that you can be and make you the person that you need to be. And so it's going to know the way in which those things need to manifest in your life. And so it's there to help with that process as well. So those are kind of the safety measures that are put in place,
Yeah.
is working with the ancestors, the guardian angel.
Yeah, that's actually probably going to be my last question because you give such thoroughly brilliant answers. So you've done the Abramelin, right? I believe.
Yes.
Is that how you made contact with your holy guardian angel?
Well, I had contact previously, and that's something where I think from the beginning, magicians should be on the lookout for and seeking contact. Your angel wants to be in contact with you. Your angel is seeking you from day one. And so you just need to kind of put yourself in a position where you become aware of that seeking and become focused and open to that seeking. And you do that through seeking the angel also, but the angel's there. The angel's already been looking for you. And so even before you're ready to jump into something like the Abramelin, your guardian angel should be part of your life, even if it's just you make some prayers to your angel, you light candles for your angel, and you just sort of, again, sit and listen and try to be in that presence and accept that guidance. When you go through the Abramelin, what you're doing is you're ramping up that connection by putting yourself into a different physical and mental state than where you would be normally, and just increasing the level of sanctity and the level of separateness for sanctification that you are kind of putting yourself into. And so that when you get to the point where you're doing the actual final key part of the ritual, then you're in a place where you and the angel can come together and you can know the angel in such a vivid and real and powerful way that it's changing, and it is something that is irrevocable, something where you have come into contact with your angel such that you now clearly understand that the angel is there with you, always present, always able to guide, always able to give advice, and able to jump in and interject when needed to. And you're sort of opening yourself to an awareness of a connection where that awareness was not there before. it's not something where that should be where the connection starts. That should be where the connection is realized in an intimate and powerful way beyond what was there before. But there should be some contact and some connection there before.
Yeah, that's nice. So it's always there, but you're just kind of slowly, I think Crowley used to describe it as a kind of courtship.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. So when I go away from you today, what's the first? You know, obviously I set up. Obviously, I'm going to get the book, but I would start with the ancestors. Do you think that's the
Yep, I
first
think
step?
that would be the first step. Would be setting up an ancestor shrine. Well, actually, start talking to the ancestors, making contact, talking with them, and then building that contact into setting up a shrine and communicating.
Okay, fantastic. So I can't wait to get the book now. I hope my listeners are also going to buy a few copies. I'll get the link. Can you send me the link so I can just post it into the little show notes?
Yep.
And thank you very much, BJ. It's been fascinating. I like to keep it down to an hour just for practical reasons. Hopefully talk again sometime, man. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for taking part in the experiment.
Thank you.
BJ Swayne. Thank you very much, mate. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.